What is the connection between glowing fish, feminizing tofu, and Latin poetic language tricks? Well, they're all coming up in this episode. Let's dig in. Welcome to Modified. I'm your host, Dr. Orlando Delange, ex-plant scientist and current science teacher. This podcast is my attempt to guide you through the science of GMOs and hopefully just enough of the history and the social context to give you a path forward in your own thinking. And if all else fails, I hope you'll enjoy some of the surprising stories and fascinating facts in the world of genetically modified plants. This is episode 14, Your Questions Answered, part 2. Let's dig in with question 1, submitted by Anton in Seattle. Question is, what about the estrogen in GMO soybeans? So you might not have heard this question, but you probably have heard of soy boys if you've been on the internet, and they are connected. It does not come from nowhere. The idea of a soy boy is somebody who eats too much tofu, and it basically reduces your testosterone and makes you less of a man. So it's kind of like a right-wing attack on people who are perceived to be not masculine, men who are perceived to be not masculine enough, and connecting it to the idea of not having enough meat in your diet and eating too much tofu. I'd say, I eat a lot of tofu. I'll proudly label myself a soy boy. And it's not from nowhere. There is some science behind it. Soy contains one of many kinds of phytoestrogen, which are chemicals that have enough structural similarity to the human hormone estrogen that they can bind to and activate estrogen receptors in the human body. Soy, so that's the plant that, you grow. Soybeans are used to make tofu, they're used to make soy milk, they are eaten by humans, edamame. They're also, primarily soybeans are actually grown in the US for animal feed. But this is thinking about, if humans directly eating soy products, you are consuming some phytoestrogen. There are other plants that also contain phytoestrogens. It's really a whole class of compounds that just by kind of chance happen to have some similarity to human estrogen and can indeed activate estrogen receptors in the human body. So there's some sort of science behind it. But let's dig into it a little bit more. One thing to point out is that phytoestrogens, like I said, just have a chance similarity to human estrogen. They are not actually in the plant hormones. They have other purposes. Most of them are secondary compounds that are kind of designed to protect the plant against microbial invaders, for example. And it's just pure coincidence that they happen to structurally mimic human estrogen. There are hundreds of thousands of different chemicals in most plants that we call phytochemicals. This is particularly true of the flowering plants, which is really pretty much all of our crop plants, all the plants we eat. Plants are amazing biochemists, and the main reason for this is because they can't move. It's probably clear. So they can't run away from pests. They can't run away if, for example, the sun gets too bright or dims a little bit. They've kind of just got to work with whatever they've got wherever they are. And so they have an amazing array of different biochemicals that can do things like that can help protect them from herbivores, from pests and pathogens, that can be kind of pigments to help them fine-tune their photosynthesis, and then other chemicals that are basically there to use internally within the plant to signal and kind of communicate within the plant what's going on and what changes need to happen. Plants are amazing biochemists, and amongst this bewildering array of biochemicals in soybeans are some chemicals that can mimic human estrogen, and we call those phytoestrogens. Phyto is like the Greek prefix for plant. So phyto in front of something generally means plant. So these phytoestrogens, total coincidence, they have no evolutionary relationship to the genes that encode the enzymes that allow the soybeans to make phytoestrogens have no common evolutionary history with the genes inside us humans, which encode enzymes that allow us to produce estrogen, which is one of the major hormones in the human body, which has an important role in coordinating many of the processes that we associate with the female body and female development. So those phytoestrogens exist. However, there is a lot of scientific debate about whether phytoestrogens even have any impact on humans, and then if they do, whether that impact is good or bad. So it's certainly, what is true is that phytoestrogens exist, and they exist in soybeans in relatively high amounts compared to some other sources of phytoestrogens. But what is not clear is, do they even have any physiological impact? And if so, what is that impact? It's very much not clear that eating a bunch of tofu is going to feminize you if you're a man. There have been studies that seem to suggest that very high amounts of consumption of phytoestrogens from soy products can indeed have physiological impacts. What's mostly been shown is protective effects against certain cancers. But there has been some research, mostly in animals, suggesting that overconsumption or consuming very large amounts of soy-based phytoestrogens could reduce sperm counts. So that's like the closest thing to something that would align to that idea of like soy boys who have eaten too much tofu and been feminized. However, the balance of evidence suggests that any impacts that exist are so small that they are not clinically relevant and just should not be something to worry about, especially if you're not kind of exclusively consuming a soy-based diet. I'm not a nutrition expert enough to weigh in on exactly what the right amount, or like whether there's what exactly the amount of soy-based products would be in your diet that you might be concerned about some physiological effect, or maybe hopeful about some protective effect against cancers. But I'm going to include some more accessible scientific content on this topic in the show notes if you want to dive into it for yourself. There's one study that I'll include, which was kind of one of the most interesting, I thought, which is a 2020 study by researchers at the University of Manchester, which looked at about 2,000 men who are in couples and were trying and struggling to conceive. So this is men who are in heterosexual couples trying to conceive, and they looked into the diet of these men. But actually what they found, they looked into multiple things, but one of the things they looked into was soy consumption to check this idea of maybe the phytoestrogens in soy are lowering sperm counts. They actually found no difference in sperm counts, but actually a positive correlation between soy consumption and sperm motility, which was, surprising. I don't think they were trying to suggest that there's a direct correlation there between the soy consumption and the sperm motility. It's probably something that correlates with the higher soy consumption. But still, definitely didn't support the idea that if you have too much tofu, you're going to have a hard time conceiving. Okay, so how does all this relate to GMOs? One thing, as I mentioned, there's a lot of GMO soybean produced, particularly in the US. As I pointed out earlier, most of that soy produced in the US, and particularly the GMO soy, goes to animal feed. And so if, for whatever reason, you were worried about consuming GMO soy products directly, just look for any product labeled organic or labeled non-GMO. So organic would automatically mean non-GMO, and then there's a specific non-GMO label that you can look for. So it's quite possible to avoid if you're concerned. However, I don't think that I looked into it. There is no plausible reason that increasing the specific GMO traits that are in soybeans, and if you can remember the last couple of episodes, when we say GMO soy in the US, that's going to mean either herbicide tolerant or BT soy. Neither of those traits is going to have any impact on the phytoestrogen level of the soy products. So that in itself will be the same, whether it's GMO or non-GMO soy, just to make that clear. I think, one of the things that this made me think about is there's kind of, when you're like in plant science and you're talking to other scientists about GMOs, and the scientists like to chuckle about non-scientists who complain about the idea of there being chemicals in their food. And you like to laugh about it because from the scientist's perspective, well, all life is made of chemicals, is made of biochemicals. And so, of course, there are chemicals in your food because that's what organisms are made of. We're all made of chemicals. as in chemicals are just combinations of atoms. And, I think it's easy to laugh about, but I think there are misconceptions on both sides of that perspective. Like I said, it is, on face value, it seems silly to complain about chemicals in your food. For the reason I explained, yes, all food is made of chemicals. But I think it's kind of being disingenuous to not see that when someone is complaining about chemicals in their food, they mean something more specific than that. They mean novel chemicals that are not products of evolution. Humans have eaten soybeans for millennia, so we know that they are generally safe to eat. Whereas a new pesticide or a protein that has never been part of the food chain before, but has been introduced into a crop via transgenesis, is scary. And how do we really know that it's safe? Maybe the effects are subtle and they take a lifetime to show up. I think it's kind of wrong to laugh about those concerns. I mean, just look at, if you remember from the last episode, current lawsuits about glyphosate, this supposedly healthy, or this herbicide that supposedly has no human health effects, which seems to be, after decades, showing to have caused cancers in people, at least according to some recent lawsuits. With all that said, personally, I don't think you should be worried about soy products in general, and I don't think you should be more worried about GMO soy products than non-soy products in this specific issue around phytoestrogens. However, I don't think it is silly to worry about chemicals in the food supply. And, I personally do buy organic produce some of the time for exactly that reason, because I also worry about what exact chemicals are going into the food supply. And, there's just a certain peace of mind knowing, okay, this produce has been produced with maybe, yes, chemicals, but chemicals that we have a longer history with and we're more familiar with and can feel more assured that they're safe. Okay, let's move on to question 2. This question was submitted by @LondonMutt on Instagram, and they asked, are there any GMO animals? And the answer is yes. So we're not really talked about GMO animals on this podcast because I wanted to keep it more narrowly focused on GMO crops to avoid it kind of spiraling out of control. But there definitely are GMO animals. There are tons and tons of GMO animals being kind of produced at least every week in research labs around the world as part of particularly biomedical research, particularly genetically engineered mice and rats and zebrafish, which is a little bit relevant to what I'm about to talk about. And these are used to do research on with no intention of them ever leaving the lab. And it'll be things like, okay, let's introduce a copy of a gene that we think might fix a clinically relevant trait and see if it does that, and that can tell us about the role of that gene in that disease, for example. That sort of thing. It happens all the time. But I think what this question was really getting at is more GMO animals and the way we think about GMO crops, something that is produced at scale out in the world. I mean, maybe in a controlled way, but still in a way that it's not just in a super controlled laboratory facility, but something that's much more readily accessible, and also something that consumers can get hold of. And I think that the biggest example of this is GloFish. I think they're the most abundant GMO animals that consumers can come into contact with, and they are the easiest to get hold of. And it's kind of an interesting story. I didn't know this, so I looked into it. It's a quite international story. The GloFish, which I'll explain a little bit more about what they are, but basically these are pet fish, or fish intended for the pet trade, which have been genetically engineered with a gene that encodes a protein that makes them glow. And I'll explain about that glowing in a second. But they're based on, originally by research done by a Singaporean scientist, Dr. Zhuwen Gong, and then picked up by separate companies and commercialized in Taiwan and the USA at the same time. And I believe it's still the case that you can only get them in the US and in Taiwan. That was back in 2003, and they've actually been going strong ever since. They seem to have been remarkably uncontroversial, and pretty successful. It's hard to find out, like, what is their sales numbers. I couldn't get that. I don't think they're taking in, billions of dollars a year, the companies who are selling them. But they do seem to be distributed very widely. You can get them online. I've seen them sold in my local Petco. So they're not hard to get hold of. They're not something super niche. And they are, so let's dive into a little bit about what they are. They are an offshoot of basic research. So I mentioned that there's these lab animals that get produced for research. Sometimes, these animals are studied, and often they're not genetically engineered, but genetically engineering lab animals for research purposes is very commonplace. And there's kind of a few species of animals that tend to get used a lot. And we call these model organisms. And there's all sorts of reasons why it's quite useful for many researchers to all work on the same animal as a model system to study, even if you're interested in human disease. Because you can kind of all share resources and share knowledge. And really, for example, by now there's like incredibly detailed understanding of really every aspect of mouse biology. And mice share a lot of things in common with us humans in that we're both mammals. And so a lot of the things that we learn from mouse biology can be applied to human biology. Another model that is used to understand human biology, but also more just to understand animal biology in general, and vertebrate biology in particular, is zebrafish. So these are small tropical fish, and one of the interesting things about them is that when they're young, the embryos or the young fish are transparent. You can really see what's happening inside of them. And that makes them, I think, just a very appealing model organism. And so they've been used for decades in research. And Dr. Zhuan Gong was researching these zebrafish, and he wasn't the first one to genetically engineer zebrafish, but he thought of this idea of what if we stick this gene for green fluorescent protein into zebrafish. And what he was thinking is we could use this as a tool to make environmental sensors. I'm not totally sure what he was envisaging here. He was basically the general concept is, okay, let's hook up this gene to a promoter. That's kind of the piece of DNA that's like the on-off switch for the gene. And have that promoter be sensitive to some environmental contaminant that we want to know about. And I don't think it was probably as naive as then we could just throw these fish into rivers, and wherever we see green fish, we know to, stay away from that river. Probably imagining more, you can have these fish in dedicated tanks, and you can kind of siphon off bits of the river water to flow through these tanks in a facility by the river, and that could tell you kind of very much the concept of a canary in the coal mine, where the canary will pass out from gases. It was kind of a visible indicator of some problem that humans would be interested in. It's a little bit naive, I think, because there are many other existing options for monitoring various toxins. And is it really that practical or that ethical to use real live living fish as tools to test for toxins in water? Nothing about this surprises me. I worked for many years in a kind of field of biotechnology that was full of people trying to use genetic engineering as a solution to every one of the world's problems, or even problems that aren't really problems. It's this kind of Jurassic Park way of thinking. It's actually not even the Jurassic Park way of thinking, which is what I mean by that is they never stopped to think long enough about whether they should. They just focused on what they could do, the scientists. And I would tweak that and say that I, encountered a lot of thinking that was, thinking about what they could, whether they should, but not knowing enough to realize that they don't know whether they should. So it's we could do this thing and it would have a great real world application, but actually you don't really know anything about that application. And maybe you should learn a little bit more about it and talk to the people who are doing that work on the ground right now before you decide that you're going to genetically engineer a solution that is impractical and no one wants. Maybe that's unfair. Maybe Dr. Gong had really thought this through and it was very practical, but the reality is that didn't happen. But instead he published this work, made these GFP positive, so it's GFP fish, basically zebrafish that express this GFP protein. And then, like, in parallel, these two companies from the US and Taiwan kind of saw this as an opportunity to sell glowing pet fish. And that's really the only thing that came out of it. And so glowing, what do I mean by glowing? So we're not talking about luminescence, which is the property of producing light. That's what glowworms and fireflies do. So those are insects. And there are some other organisms that can do this, which is genuinely producing light from chemicals that, have no color, produce no light. You give them, put the right chemicals together with some energy in the form of a molecule called ATP, and it's kind of like, lighting a spark. Like, it genuinely produces light. And that exists, but that is not what is in these glowfish. Instead, what we're talking about is fluorescence, which is mostly when you hear scientists talking about glowing things, they mean fluorescence. And what fluorescence is it's a property that many molecules have, where they absorb light at one wavelength, and then they'll generally absorb a small amount of that light to shift the wavelength of the light to a different color on the visible light spectrum, and then emit that light in the new, slightly lower energy wavelength. And what this means for the GFP protein is it can make it look like it's producing light because it can absorb ultraviolet light, which human eyes can't really see, and then release green light. So ultraviolet light is very high energy light. Green light is a bit lower energy. And so they're basically absorbing the UV, kind of some of that energy is being lost, but then they're re-emitting the light at that lower wavelength. And yeah, so that's... It sounds kind of weird, but there's all sorts of ways that this particular property is kind of like converting light from one wavelength to another is incredibly useful, and you can do all sorts of amazing scientific research with it. But in this case, it's purely just for aesthetic fun purposes. The glowfish is just for amusement. And so what you can do is, and how this is done in practice, is you'd get these glowfish and you'd get them in conjunction with a dark light, which is just a light that produces UV, and you install that into the tank so that the fish glow these cool colors. And it does look like they are emitting light. They seem to have a glow to them, but they are not actually producing light from themselves. They're really, it's not quite the same as just reflecting light. Like, it does look more like it is being emitted from the fish themselves, but it's basically just reflecting light at a different color. And there's not just, the GFP version with this green fluorescent protein was the first kind. There are now actually quite a few different colors because there are many kinds of fluorescent proteins. There are many kinds of fluorescent molecules in general, but there are also many kinds of fluorescent proteins, and these are not something that have been designed in a lab, but naturally evolved. And actually, the two that are used in the glowfish are both from cnidarians, which is the phylum of animals, which is the jellyfish, corals, and sea anemones. And a lot of cnidarians happen to produce fluorescent proteins. I'm not really sure why. It's often associated with the ones that live in deeper waters. And there's the GFP comes from a jellyfish that actually was first, the protein was isolated from these jellyfish in the waters, the Pacific Northwest, where I live. There's also a red version of these glowfish that uses a red fluorescence protein, that's literally what it's called, that was isolated from Discosoma, which is a coral. And so you can get basically kind of like red variant, green variant. I think there are actually others. And because there are by now a kind of whole spectrum of these different, what we call fluorescent proteins, that some of them, it's taking one that exists, like green fluorescent protein, and then indeed in a lab tweaking it to change the portion of the protein that gives it this fluorescent property to change the color that it emits. So an example of that would be the yellow fluorescent protein, which is just a tweaked variant of the green fluorescent protein. So you can get various different colors of these glowfish, And they're not just zebrafish, it's a few related, or not related, like kind of superficially similar small tropical aquarium fish, such as betta fish, which you can get sold as GloFish, which is a trademark. So, if that sounds very cool and exciting to you, go buy a GloFish and have fun. They are all patented. From what I can see, the GloFish company is right on top of patent protection, and they are very clear that it is illegal to breed their fish. So, if you remember talking about herbicide tolerance, it's kind of a similar story. Like, companies want to protect their patents. That's just the case of it. Although digging around from some Reddit posts from people who are into aquarium breeding, it does sound like the GloFish company in the US is not actually bothering to go around suing small-scale breeders, but more that they wouldn't want any large-scale operations and want to make sure they could shut that down. I'm not so sure about it, so I would not recommend you start going to try and breed and selling GloFish, because you would probably get into trouble. Okay, and I'll end talking about GloFish with just, I said they are not very controversial. There just does not seem to have been any big outcry and backlash about them. They were illegal specifically in California from their first appearance in 2003 up until 2016. So clearly there was some opposition, and that was because of concerns about a number of things, including the ethics of creating these genetically modified fish. But it was overturned after 13 years of widespread sale because there didn't seem to be any particular risks to humans or any particular animal welfare concerns in practice. And interestingly, this is something hot off the presses. In 2026, there was an act passed in California, the Ethics Over Aesthetics Act, that banned the import and sale of genetically engineered pets in California, kind of preemptively, because that's not really a thing, apart from these GloFish. And there was a specific carve-out saying that GloFish were exempt from this ban. Okay, so that's enough about GloFish. I'll talk about the one other prominent GMO animal that is also, in fact, a fish. And it's a long story. I'm just going to give you a few cliff notes about it. So what it is a GMO salmon. And salmon is a word for a set of related species that are all fairly big fish when they are adults, and that start their life in freshwater rivers and streams and then swim into the ocean, returning to freshwater to spawn. And they are all related. It's one family, but a set of different species. And it is quite an unusual life history. Most fish cannot do this transition from seawater to freshwater. That generally requires different adaptations. So it's quite interesting. There's one species of salmon that lives in the Atlantic, and there's a bunch of different salmon species that live in the Pacific Ocean, including sockeye and chinook. And the Pacific salmon are considered tastier in general, and they grow year-round compared to seasonal growth for Atlantic salmon, so they get bigger. But for various reasons, Pacific salmon are wild-caught and they can't be farmed, which makes them more expensive. So you may well have heard, like, oh yeah, I heard something about these genetically engineered salmon, like, fairly recently they've been in the news. But they actually have a very long history. They go back to the beginning of the kind of initial wave of GMO fever back in 1989. And it's been a kind of 3-decade regulatory and corporate battle to bring them to market. So what is the product? It is an Atlantic salmon that was genetically engineered to carry a transgene. But in this case, it's not, for example, trying to take a gene from bacteria to stick it into fish. It's another fish gene. It's a chimeric gene, meaning one that contains pieces from different original genes. And it's actually the growth hormone gene from Pacific salmon, which, as I mentioned, grow faster because they grow all year round. And then with a promoter from a different fish species that really will make sure this gene is produced at a high amount all year round. And this transgene, when inserted into the Atlantic salmon, in practice makes them constantly produce this growth hormone, which makes them grow year round and grow faster when they are growing, which basically means you get to mature sellable size earlier. And really, like, the advantage here is more for the producer than for the consumer, because what it means is that the producer can churn out like more fish per year. They don't have to like invest as long in feeding and keeping the fish before they're big enough to sell. It's just, from the consumer's perspective, they all look the same. It's just that what might have been a fish that's been alive for 4 years would now be a fish that's only been alive for 2 years, but has grown to the same size as a 4-year-old fish in that time. And the product was called Aqua Advantage Salmon, and the company Aqua Bounty. And I'm using past tense there for a reason we'll get to. Because basically it got caught up in decades of political rambling, where at various points the FDA in the US did approve sale, but politicians intervened. So in 2015, 2015 is still about 25 years after the initial creation of this GMO salmon. The FDA finally approved it, but no sooner had the FDA, who is the Food and Drug Administration, and are one of the key agencies that would have to, for a GMO food animal, they're the only relevant agency to my knowledge. For GMO crops, there are other agencies, but the FDA is a very important federal agency in the US for these things. The FDA approved it in 2015, but the US Congress literally inserted a clause into a spending bill from that year to specifically stop the production of the salmon. That bill from Congress was overturned in 2019. So it looked like in 2019, okay, this is going to go ahead and this salmon is going to get sold. But a federal court in 2020 found that the initial FDA approval was unlawful. And that kind of put them back to square one. As you can imagine, it would be hard for a company to keep pursuing a product that is locked in decades of limbo like that. And indeed, by 2024, the Aqua Advantage salmon, the product, was basically shelved for all practical purposes without ever making it to the US consumers. I was looking this up, I was surprised. Apparently I have a brief period of being sold in Canada. But from what I can see, it is not being sold to consumers anywhere anymore. The main concerns were the normal ones around GMOs, concern around safety for human health, worries about the general idea of genetically modified food feeling like an abomination, and the way that a real living thing, a salmon, is so transparently turned into a commercial product. But there was also an additional concern, which was the farming idea, which is, so these are Atlantic salmon, which are traditionally farmed. So that in itself was not the worry. But what if, these fish farms basically look like giant nets in the ocean? And nets can get holes in them. Fish do escape from fish farms. What if these GMO salmon escaped and then bred with non-GMO Atlantic salmon? That kind of like interaction and crossbreeding between GMO and non-GMO organisms is not something that's happened before and people are concerned about. Well, to overcome that, Aqua Bounty said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to rear these salmon on the Pacific coast. Because these are Atlantic salmon, they aren't Atlantic salmon in the Pacific. They wouldn't be able to interbreed with the other salmon that are in the Pacific. So that gets rid of that problem. But, as I mentioned, Pacific salmon are not farmed. And so if that kind of large-scale salmon farming doesn't happen on the Pacific coast, and people generally like it that way because fish farms carry a range of ecological problems with them. It's basically like put that many fish tightly packed into one space kind of year round, and what you get is like a lot of waste being produced as the fish poop and like the kind of excess fish food and stuff like that. That can really kind of harm the quality, like water quality. You also get a lot of pests. There are some quite unpleasant things like sea lice that tend to, when you get all these fish tightly packed together, these pests will appear and they can then spread to local fish populations. So like local salmon fishers in, fisheries in the Pacific coast weren't very happy about this. And so Aqua Bounty were like, okay, we'll be even more accommodating. And what we're going to do is farm them in massive terrestrial ponds. So not even in the ocean. We're going to farm them. We're going to build like big warehouses with giant swimming pools, but not swimming pools, fish ponds, and farm them in these seawater fish ponds. And this is done with a few other fish like tilapia. It's not a totally crazy idea, but it does obviously then make it a lot more expensive, because if you think about a fish farm in the ocean, at least the ocean part of it is free. And you're just kind of putting a giant net into the ocean that already exists, compared to having to build and maintain a massive warehouse. And from what I looked into it does seem that the Aqua Bounty company does still exist, and they had a press release in 2025 claiming to still be planning to proceed with their product, which doesn't quite jive with other press releases from 2024 saying, they're basically done. I'm not really sure in practice what is going on there. Maybe they're still exploring just kind of other ways they could use some of the technology they've developed around the idea of terrestrial salmon farming. We'll see. But I would not expect to see any GMO salmon on your plate anytime soon. Okay, let's move into our final question, which was submitted by Matthew from Bremerton, which was, how do GMOs, affect the body's digestion processes? I want to address this question in two parts, directly and indirectly. So to directly address the question, the answer is basically no GMO crops in common consumption seem to have any significant impact on the body's digestion process or on digestive health or human health more broadly. But let me unpack that. So I said significant there. So I mean that in more of the scientific meaning, which basically means that if you gather a whole bunch of data and analyze it using statistical tests that can basically tell you, are there patterns in this data that you wouldn't expect to see by chance alone? If there are, then you call those significant patterns, basically. And this is, part of that process is gathering a whole bunch of data. So basically, no one has gathered a whole bunch of data on the impact of GMO crops on human health that has shown any significant impact of the consumption of GMO crops on human health. That is a high bar, and it does not mean that there are no effects, because that would rely on there having been studies. And there's actually, I think, I'm not going to say shocking, but surprising lack of large studies on humans of the impact of GMO crop consumption on human health. And I think it's surprising, given that they've been around so long and there's so many studies on so many different things that might impact human health, that this is just not something that's really been studied. And I think for some people it might feel shocking, because it's something that a lot of people do have concerns about, and they might want to see those studies exist. But the thing is, the way, when it comes to food products, it's not that there's no safety review that's happened, but the way let me backtrack a little bit. You might expect there to have been more studies that have basically directly looked at, okay, let's take 1,000 people who are going to eat GMO crops, we're going to eat GMO soybeans for a year, and 1,000 people who are going to not eat GMO soybeans for a year, and then we're going to just track all of their health outcomes and see what happens. Because that's exactly the sort of study that would need to happen for any new drug, meaning medical product. That's the case in the US, but pretty much everywhere. That we call those are called clinical trials. And the process of requiring those clinical trials in order to then be allowed to sell the product is pre-market approval. But that's actually quite specific for medical products. And even then, just drugs. That's not the bar that's used, for example, for a new type of Band-Aid or a new type of wheelchair. Instead, with those kinds of medical products and with food, you don't generally require pre-market approval. Instead, you basically have to submit a packet of information to the relevant agency, depending on the country that you're in, that just says, okay, here's everything we know about this food and its kind of molecular composition, and here's why we think it's safe, mostly from a kind of basic biology perspective, which will be, okay, well, all of the kind of constituent molecules in this food, so say it's a GMO crop, it's like we've analyzed all of the chemicals that now exist in this soybean after we, for example, introduced the BT protein, And we can see that there's really no change compared to the type of soy that people have been eating for millennia. The only difference is there's now this one new protein called BT in it. And then we also did some basic toxicology with that protein, meaning tests in animals and some other kind of lab-based tests. And we see no reason to think that that BT protein will have any impact on human health. And so, we request approval to sell this product, and that then gets granted. And then it's basically from that point, people can report concerns to, for example, in the US, that may be to the FDA would be the relevant agency. If they think that they have experienced a negative health outcome associated with that food. And then that could lead to approval to sell that food being withdrawn after the fact. That's how it works for foods. That's how it works for a lot of products. For example, cosmetics. Cosmetics do not have to be subject to clinical trials before they are released into the world. You do have to show some basic toxicology, depending on quite what it is. Sometimes you don't even need to do that. And then in general, there is always this kind of after the fact option of, okay, well, we'll just kind of release it into the market. And if people have issues with it, they can report those, and then we could retroactively ban sale. Not retroactively ban sale. We could ban sale going forward after it's already been released as a commercial product. But basically, yeah, for GMO crops, there was toxicology that was done, that was reviewed by the FDA in the USA, and saying, okay, we see no plausible biological basis for this to cause any harm to human health and disease. And then to follow that up, there's been now decades of people consuming these crops, and there has not been any evidence of impacts on human health. But there haven't been these large clinical trials to directly test whether or not there is any impact. So it's a mixture of evidence there. Or maybe not the amount of evidence you might want to see, that many people, I think, want to see. But with that said, there's certainly no evidence to say that there are harms caused by consumption of GMO crops. And we probably would expect to see that by now, given how widespread their consumption is, especially if those harms were pronounced and had like a serious impact. Okay, so that's kind of the direct answer to the question. The indirect answer comes to what I mentioned at the very start of this episode, which is like Latin poetic language. And there's, I did Latin at school, so this is why this popped into my head. But it also appeared in a movie title not too long ago, synecdoche, which is a term for like a poetic construction where you use a part to mean the whole. So using like sword to mean soldier, or something like that. And it's basically like a kind of metaphorical, poetic way of speaking, where really we say one thing, but we really mean something much bigger that is often associated with that smaller, more concrete item. And I think it's made me think about that with GMOs. Like, I think that there's a similar thing going on. So for many people, especially those who aren't scientists, who are not like me, kind of steeped in exactly what at the molecular level is a GMO or is not a GMO, I think that the term GMO can often be used in this way where it represents really what they mean by saying GMO is the whole contemporary system of industrial agriculture. And I think that there are many ways that our contemporary system of industrial agriculture that, for example, has a lot of like highly processed, high sugar foods are not very good for human health. And so I think it's quite reasonable. I can understand why someone might say, why are GMOs bad for your health? And really mean, it's not, they don't mean specifically just GMOs, but GMOs as part of this system of agriculture as this huge industry where there's like mega farms and faceless, uncaring corporations who just want to make as much profit as possible without really thinking about what's good for people and their health. I think that's the sort of idea that is being communicated there, and I think that there is some merit to there. I'm not, like I said, I'm not a nutrition expert, so I'll just end by also saying that yes, I can see why some people might think, okay, GMOs, that's basically industrial agriculture, that's high fructose corn syrup, that's all these things that are bad about our food system, and I hate that, and so it's making me, GMO foods make me unhealthy. There are, in fact, GMO crops that are designed specifically to improve human health. At least one, and that is the purple tomato, and I'm going to talk about that in our next episode. See what I did there? Nice segue. So I'm going to wrap us up here. Our next episode is going to be the penultimate episode of Season 1, where I'm going to give you a little bit of a whirlwind tour of some other GMO crops that maybe are not as big in terms of sales as BT crops and herbicide-tolerant crops, but I think are kind of interesting and fun. Maybe you've heard about them, maybe you haven't. And then we're going to end the season by talking about CRISPR. So as a reminder, please, if you've been enjoying the podcast, leave a review, tell a friend, follow me on Instagram at SeattlePlantNerd, and you can just go to the podcast website if you don't remember that. The podcast website is www.modifiedpod.com, and we're not going to do our 5 take-home messages from this episode. It's a little bit of an unusual one, so we'll just wrap it up there, and hope that you'll tune in again soon. Bye!